I spent most of my life believing that the sacrifices I made for my son would one day be recognized, if not with words of gratitude, then at least with the way he lived his life. Parents don't expect perfection from their children. We don't demand medals or applause. What we hope for is something simpler, that the lessons we carve into their upbringing, often with sweat and exhaustion, will take root. That they'll learn from our struggles, avoid our mistakes, and carry forward a little piece of wisdom we paid dearly for. But my son didn't see it that way. From the time he was young, he had an arrogance that was both admirable and infuriating. He believed he was destined for success, convinced that his future would unfold easily, without the hardship and scraping that defined my own life. And while confidence can be a gift, in him, it was edged with pride, sharp enough to cut through every piece of advice I ever tried to give him. I worked 2 jobs when he was a boy. Mornings started before sunrise, packing boxes in a warehouse with a back that never stopped aching. Evenings ended at a diner, balancing trays and forcing smiles when my body begged to rest. Every dollar I earned had a destination: rent, food, clothes for him, and a tiny savings account I opened in his name. There were nights I went to bed hungry just to make sure he had lunch money for school. And through it all, I told myself it would be worth it. That one day he would understand. That one day, when I gave him advice about money, about being careful, about living within his means, he would listen because he would know where those words came from. But when the time came, he brushed it all aside. He got his first real job right out of college, thanks in no small part to the support I had given him. The tuition I covered with loans I'll probably die still paying, the car I bought secondhand so he could get to interviews, the safety net that kept him from drowning when rent outpaced his paycheck. For him, though, all of that was just background noise. He was convinced his success was his alone. One evening, not long after he landed the job, we sat at the kitchen table. I had poured him coffee, the way I always did when I wanted to talk. Seriously, he was scrolling through his phone, half listening as I spoke. "You need to start saving," I told him gently. "Don't spend every paycheck just because you finally have one. Put some aside. Build an emergency fund. Life doesn't always go the way you expect." He didn't even look up. He chuckled, almost condescendingly, and said, Times are different now. You grew up poor. That doesn't mean I will. I make good money. I'm not going to waste my 20s pinching pennies like you did." Pinching pennies. That was how he saw it. The years of grinding labor, of patching holes in my shoes so he could have new ones, of eating leftovers night after night just so there would be enough in the bank to cover his future. To him, it was nothing more than pathetic penny pinching. I felt the sting of those words in a way I can't describe. Parents don't expect applause, but dismissiveness, that cuts deep. Still, I swallowed my pride and tried again. "Listen to me. Debt is quicksand. Don't live above your means. Just because the money's coming in now doesn't mean it always will. Trust me. I've seen how fast life can turn." But he shook his head, grinned like he knew better, and said, "Relax, Mom. I've got this." And that was that. I watched as he filled his life with things that glittered but had no weight. Expensive dinners, luxury clothes, trips with friends, where he posted photos online with captions about living his best life. He signed a lease on a high-rise apartment he could barely afford, bought furniture on credit, and laughed when I asked him about savings. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see through the haze of his pride, was that life doesn't reward arrogance. Life punishes it. And sure enough, it came for him. It started small. An unexpected medical bill he didn't have the savings to cover. A car repair that drained what little remained in his account. Then a layoff at work, sudden and brutal. His income cut off with no warning. Suddenly, the apartment that had seemed like a trophy became a noose tightening around his neck. The credit card bills piled up. The friends he had spent money trying to impress disappeared the moment he couldn't keep up. And then, one evening, my phone rang. His voice was different this time. No arrogance, no pride, just panic. Mom, he said, his voice cracking. I need help. I don't know what to do. I'm drowning. And as I sat there, listening to him beg for the lifeline I had once begged him to build for himself, I thought back to that night at the kitchen table, to the smirk on his face, to the words that cut me open, pinching pennies. And in that moment, I realized something. Life was teaching him the lesson he had refused to learn from me. When he called me that night, his words tumbled out in a frantic blur. I could hear the raw fear in his voice, the kind of fear that strips away pride and leaves only desperation behind. Mom, please, I don't know what to do. I've missed 2 rent payments. They're threatening to evict me. My car's in the shop and they won't release it until I pay. I need a loan, just to get me through until I find something else. Please. I closed my eyes and let his words wash over me. For years, I had pictured this moment, not out of malice, but out of inevitability. I knew life would humble him one way or another. I just didn't think it would come this soon. In that silence, I remembered every ignored warning, every dismissive smirk, every time he had looked at me as though my sacrifices were irrelevant relics of a life he'd never have to live. He had mistaken my endurance for weakness. He had confused my caution for small-mindedness. And now, here he was, begging for the wisdom he once ridiculed. I wanted to help him. God knows I wanted to reach through the phone, hold him, tell him everything would be okay, the way I did when he was a boy who scraped his knees. But this wasn't a skinned knee. This was a fracture in his character, one that would only heal if he faced the pain of it. So I steadied my voice and asked, "How much do you need?" There was a pause, then a shaky exhale of relief. Just enough to cover 3 months' rent, and maybe a little extra for the car. I swear, Mom, once I get another job, I'll pay you back. Please, I'll do better this time. I promises. I had heard them before. I told him I would think about it. He thanked me over and over, convinced that my hesitation was simply logistics. But when the call ended, I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, staring at the wall as if it might give me the answer. And slowly, clarity settled in. He didn't need my money. He needed my silence. He needed me to do what he had done to me so many times before, ignore the desperate calls for help, let the silence teach louder than any words ever could. So I didn't transfer the money. The next morning, I woke to a string of messages from him, polite at first, then pleading, then angry. "Mom, did you forget? Please, I really need this. Why aren't you answering me? After everything I've done, you can't even help me out." That last one cut deeper than he realized. After everything he had done, he truly believed that the little he had contributed, the occasional dinner he bought me, the rare phone call to check in, outweighed the years I spent working myself into the ground just so he could have a chance at this life he was squandering. I didn't reply. 2 days later, he showed up at my door. His suit, once sharp and pristine, was wrinkled. His face, usually lit with confidence, looked hollow. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight. "Why?" he asked, before I could even greet him. "Why won't you help me?" I gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, fists clenched at his sides like a child trying to contain a tantrum. "You always told me you'd be there for me," he continued. "You raised me alone. You sacrificed so much. And now, when I finally need you—" "Finally?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Do you think this is the first time you've needed me? You've needed me every step of your life, and I've been there. I was there when I worked double shifts so you could go to college. I was there when I ate scraps so you could eat fresh. I was there when I warned you, begged you not to live like this. But you didn't. Need me then, did you? No, then I was just a relic, a voice you could dismiss." He looked at me, stunned, his anger softening into something closer to shame. "Mom, I'm sorry," he whispered. I sighed and leaned back in my chair. "You don't need my money. You need to learn. Because if I hand you a stack of cash right, now what will change? You'll spend it, just like you spent everything else, and in 6 months, you'll be standing here again, asking for more. No, son. Life is teaching you what you refuse to learn from me, and I won't get in its way. He slumped into the chair across from me, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, I saw not the arrogant young man who thought he had the world figured out, but the frightened boy who used to cling to me in thunderstorms. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't. Because sometimes love doesn't mean saving someone. Sometimes it means stepping back and letting the storm break over them, so that when they finally stand again, it's on stronger ground. The first eviction notice came 2 weeks later. I didn't hear about it from him. I found out when a thin, crumpled envelope showed up in my mailbox, his name scrawled across the front in handwriting that wasn't his. Inside was a letter from his landlord, desperate to reach someone who could cover what he couldn't. It was as though the world knew he had always had a safety net, me, and now that it was gone, the cracks were spreading faster than he could patch them. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, my hands trembling. My heart screamed at me to go, to intervene, to save him before he slipped too far. But my mind knew that if I stepped in now, the lesson would never take root. A week after that, his car was repossessed. He called me at midnight, his awenda voice broken and small. Mom, they actually took it. I begged them. I told them I'd pay next week, but they didn't care. I don't even know how I'm supposed to get to interviews now. His words shattered me. Every fiber of my being wanted to drive across town and hand him my keys, but I didn't. Instead, I reminded him of the buses that ran past his street, of the neighbors he had once bragged about never needing. There was a long silence. Then, for the first time, I heard him sob. Not the frustrated outbursts he had when things didn't go his way, not the angry tears of a man who thought the world owed him more, but raw, gut-deep crying. That night, after I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, staring at the shadows crawling across the wall. I told myself this was what tough love looked like, but if I'm honest, it felt more like cruelty. And then came the final blow. One evening, he knocked on my door, his clothes wrinkled, his shoes scuffed. His once proud shoulders slumped forward as though the weight of the world had finally settled on him. He carried a duffel bag, light enough to tell me he hadn't brought much, heavy enough to tell me he had nowhere else to go. They kicked me out, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been sleeping on a friend's couch, but he wants me gone. I don't have anyone else. Just let me stay here a few nights. I'll figure it out. Looking at him broke something in me. This wasn't the son who brushed off my advice with arrogance. This wasn't the man who thought money grew on ambition alone. This was a humbled, wounded boy, finally stripped of his illusions. I opened the door wider. "Come in," I said softly. He dropped the bag by the door and sank into the same chair where we'd had our last argument. His hands shook as he rubbed at his face, and when he finally looked at me, his eyes were red but steady. "Mom," he whispered, "you were right about everything. I thought I was smarter than you. I thought the world was different now, that I didn't have to live like you did. But I was wrong. I should have listened. I should have learned." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I forced myself to hold them back. Because this was the moment I had been waiting for. The breaking wasn't what mattered. The rebuilding was. I reached across the table, resting my hand on his trembling fingers. "Then it's not too late. The money I saved wasn't for you to waste. It was for you to learn. And now that you finally understand, I can help you. Not by handing you a stack of bills, but by showing you how to stand on your own 2 feet." For the first time in months, he didn't flinch at my words. He nodded, quietly, humbly. And in that moment, I knew that love hadn't failed him. It had finally reached him. The first morning he stayed at my house, he woke up before me. That surprised me. My son, who used to roll out of bed at noon and talk about grinding while scrolling on his phone, was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a notepad in front of him. His eyes were still tired, but they carried a new kind of weight, one that wasn't pride, but determination. "I need to start over," he said quietly, without me even asking. "But this time, I want to do it right. Can you show me?" Those words, "Can you show me?" carried more meaning than I think he even realized. For years, he had brushed off my advice, treating my sacrifices like old relics of a past that no longer applied. But now in his brokenness, he was asking me not for money, not for rescue, but for wisdom. I pulled out the same old binder I had once used when money was tight after his father left. Yellowing pages, handwritten notes, simple budgeting charts drawn in pencil. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. It was the foundation that had kept food on our table and a roof over our heads. We sat together, side by side, and I showed him how I once divided every dollar: rent, utilities, food, savings, and only after those were covered did anything else matter. At first he sighed and rubbed his forehead, overwhelmed by the structure. But then slowly, I saw the same light I had once seen in him as a child when he finally solved a difficult puzzle. "This makes sense," he admitted. "It's strict, but it makes sense." The weeks that followed were grueling. I didn't make it easy for him. I set boundaries. No handouts, no blank checks, no easy outs. But I gave him tools. We spent evenings practicing how to cook cheap filling meals instead of ordering takeout. I took him to thrift stores and showed him how to stretch a dollar without shame. And I sat with him late at night as he applied for jobs. Not the glamorous startup CEO dreams he once bragged about, but steady, honest work. The first job he landed was at a local hardware store. Minimum wage, long hours, sore feet. He came home exhausted, his palms blistered from moving lumber and stocking shelves. But there was pride in his voice when he dropped his first paycheck onto the table. $278, he said, grinning. "It's not much, but it's mine." I smiled back, though my throat tightened with tears I refused to shed. Because in that moment, I saw him beginning to understand what sacrifice and discipline really meant. Months passed. The boy who once scoffed at my advice slowly became a man who lived by it. He tracked his expenses down to the cent, saved a portion of every paycheck, and even began paying down the debts that had once drowned him. Each milestone was small. An overdue bill cleared, $100 in savings, a week's worth of groceries bought without borrowing. But together, they built something stronger than money. They built character. And as I watched him rebuild, I realized something important. My silence had been loud enough. By stepping back, by refusing to catch him every time he stumbled, I had finally given him the space to find his own balance. One night, as we sat on the porch together, he turned to me with a look I'll never forget. "Mom," he said, his voice steady now. "Thank you for not bailing me out, for letting me fall. I hated you for it at the time, but now I know it was the only way I'd ever learn." I reached over, squeezed his hand, and smiled through the tears. "You don't need to thank me," I whispered. "Just promise me one thing. When life tests you again, don't forget this lesson. And one day, when someone you love is as stubborn as you were, remember how hard it was to let go and how necessary it was." He nodded, and in that moment, I saw not just my son, but a man who had finally grown into the kind of strength I had always hoped he would carry. Because love isn't always about protecting someone from pain. Sometimes, love is the pain. The ache of letting go, the silence that forces them to listen, the sacrifice of watching them break so they can truly rebuild. And as I looked at him that night, I realized maybe that was my greatest lesson to him all along.